entry 52, next to the last entry in the journal. This is dated Thursday, August 20th, 1964, so just a little over a month before the release. And you say in this entry, which is 2 pages long, you say, "Today was a big day," and it's because you delivered Chapter 2 to the GPO.
Yes, but you forgot to note that "today was a big day" was in all caps.
It was in all caps. I think it's the only sentence in the entire journal if it's in all caps.
Yes, that's probably true, and I did deliver a copy of Chapter 2. The paragraph reminds me of the fact that after the chapter had been approved by the commission, we still felt we had some responsibilities, was making sure that the chapter might be improved in certain respects, and this indicates that I did some work on portions of these materials, and including rewriting the section explaining why the president was not turned over by the medical personnel at Parkland Hospital, unquote. I don't know what I found defective in that very, very important subject, but I tried to clarify it in some way that I thought was important enough at this late date to do. The commission was also meeting on this occasion, and they were in the midst of reviewing the Chapter 8 on presidential protection that had been discussed by Norman and myself with the Chief Justice just a day or so before. And they were working through it very carefully, and it had been edited by Lloyd Weinreb, who I had hired to be an assistant to the Attorney General of the Criminal Division for the forthcoming year, he having just completed his clerkship. And since he had a month that he was going to use on vacation, and I needed his services, he felt it was politic of him to put aside his recreational objections and come help me. He was a Harvard Law School graduate and went on to become a very famous professor of criminal law at the Harvard Law School. He was a superb editor, and he and Mr. Stern had collaborated in producing the chapter, which on the whole was being approved by the commission, but they wanted to take extra care with it because they did recognize it to be the only aspect of the report that was forthcoming in the sense of trying to make recommendations as to actions in the future that might minimize the risk of further assassinations.
Towards the bottom of the page, you say, you mention what you call, quote, the latest Liebler draft of Chapter 7. You touched on this a moment ago in a previous entry where you mentioned that Mr. Liebler submitted memos regarding changes that he recommended for the different chapters, even chapters that he had no previous experience working with.
Yes, this particular paragraph reflects Jim's a view about motive, and basically the conversation was directed at his latest draft of Chapter 7. So this particular debate included a chapter that he had written and addressed the motive, and the dispute was the extent to which there should be any emphasis in the discussion to Oswald's commitment to Marxism, and the second was the extent to which it might be suggested that Oswald may have thought that he was aiding Castro's Cuba by killing the president. And Jim's current draft made both points, emphasizing Oswald's ideological commitment to Marxism and his pro-Castro activities in New Orleans and elsewhere. So both Lee Rankin and Norman Redlich had some difficulty in accepting Jim's emphasis on these two issues, and Jim was of the view that there was a conspiracy among the staff to eliminate or sharply curtail any reference to Oswald's political allegiances. And Rankin, on the other hand, was concerned about what the far-right interest might do with any discussion of such political issues in the report. it was unclear exactly where this discussion was going, but I was sort of in between, sometimes agreeing with Jim Liebler, sometimes agreeing with Norman, and generally being more of a bystander than a participant in this particular discussion.
Well, it would be difficult to outline a specific motive or even make suggested motives when there's really no concrete evidence of why, assuming Oswald acted alone, why he would have committed this crime. So it would have changed the entire nature of the report, I think, if you would come down on one side or the other.
It does bother me, and we may talk about this further, but there are so many elements that would go into expressing a motive, and how could you rationally identify any particular motive unless it was embraced by the person who was alleged to have the motive? I mean, all you could do is try to infer from actions or statements what were the principal motive or motives affecting him. And you will recall we discussed the judgments of the 3 psychiatrists who listed some of the things that are routinely discussed when Oswald's personality and background is the subject. Matters like, inability to have meaningful relationships with people, hostility to his environment, and the concept that he should be recognized as a great man. Now, does all that add up to a motive? I'm not sure. Yeah. So in any event, but I think this was one of the very few occasions where the sort of the political differences among members of the staff is reflected in a debate about how to handle a particular matter in the report.
The last chapter is very interesting because
the last paragraph?
Last paragraph, excuse me, because the members of the staff are in essence raising the same concerns that the commission members raised an entry or so back about the possibility of a conspiracy not being adequately investigated, and it seems that Mr. Griffin is the most outspoken on this.
Yes, I had forgotten about some of this, but this is an area of conspiracy where Bert Griffin was very actively engaged, and I should make the point, as I have before, that Bert Griffin was among the most dedicated members of the staff, and one of the most persistent in insisting that the investigative process be fully exploited, and very demanding in the way in which sections of the report be prepared, in which he had an interest. He did a good deal of the drafting, of course, and for the most part was receptive to editing by either Norman or myself, or accepting suggestions from Jim Liebler. But there were some specific investigative inquiries that came up at this late day, and two are mentioned here. One of those relates to an allegation involving a woman named Sylvia Odio, who lived in Dallas and was the daughter of a well-known Cuban figure who was anti-Castro. And her allegiances were very much in the anti-Castro side, and she had been interviewed and reported that on September 25th, or at approximately that date, she had been visited by 3 individuals. 2 of those individuals were anti-Castro advocates who came to her apparently because she was of the same political allegiance, and they were talking about the need to raise funds or to implement their activities. And the third member of their party was someone that she testified was identified to her as Leon Oswald. And she defined him as being a slight man who was white and not Hispanic in that sense. So the question was this true? Could Oswald, in fact, have made a trip to Dallas on or about that date and still managed to make the bus in Houston that took him across the border into Mexico, where it was reflected that he was crossed the border at a particular time on the 26th. In any event, it was the only way it could be posited was that Oswald may have left New Orleans perhaps earlier than previously thought by a day, and that he accompanied these two anti-Castro persons who drove him, although everyone knew that he was very pro-Castro, and he'd been a public figure in New Orleans and had been interviewed on the radio and maybe the television.
That's right.
With respect to his campaign on behalf of Castro. So, but the Celia Odio was firm in her judgment, and people who've looked at it say, well, it could have been done. Even though it's implausible, he might have sought out these people, and that it would have been necessary for them to drive him, I guess, to Houston. After meeting with her, it was unclear what emerged from that discussion, except that he was being introduced to her as someone who was strongly opposed, I guess, to the president. In any event, there was a dispute within the staff about this. It was the subject of more than one investigative request to the FBI to try to ascertain the probabilities of this happening. They were very helpful in pursuing this matter on behalf of the commission. And eventually, Jim Lieberman went to interview her and take a deposition. So there was a strong sense among some members of the staff, I forget whether Bert was among them, that this was a substantial investigative lead, and it should be featured in the report. And I was not very supportive of that, because finally, when I asked Jim Liebler, sure in private at one point, well, what's your assessment of this? And he reported to me that he thought she was telling the truth, but that she was mistaken.
And that's really kind of how it.
Well, that's how, I forget the extent to which we discussed it. There must have been at least a paragraph, I suppose, in the report. But what's interesting is that it's one of the very few issues on which Bugliosi disagrees with the Warren Commission. Because to my surprise, when I read portions of his volume, his 1,600-page volume,
right.
He did say, more or less say, well, it could have happened, and maybe it did. And so it didn't lead anywhere particularly in terms of generating new conspiracy opportunities to explore, but I thought it was significant that he differed, whereas I thought the probabilities and the personalities involved just didn't seem to me to be accurate. However, so that was one of those remaining issues in the conspiracy area. There were one or two others, and we tried in each case to try to do what was necessary to secure the support of the staffer involved with what we had done. And that, as evidence in this paragraph, there also was a debate about having a special section on Marina Oswald. There still were members of the staff who felt that she had not been sufficiently interrogated, and that there may have been some improper role that she was being asked to play by the Soviet Union or wherever. And they were concentrating principally on the fact that she had not told the truth on several important matters at the beginning, and that later on, when she was questioned about a possible shooting by her husband of President Nixon's when he visited Dallas, and that proved to be very vague, and she was unable to document it, and the dates never fit with her recollection. And it was an appearance before the commission in which she revealed herself as a very, very unstable, unreliable witness.
We're going to talk a little bit more about Marina as when we wrap this up. Before we go to the next entry, just a brief moment. You mentioned Mr. Griffin here, and I want to circle back to the issue with Pat Dean and the criticism of Mr. Griffin essentially saying he was not being truthful. Do you have any wrap-up comments on that?
Yes, I do. The Bert Griffin issue arose out of his deposition of, it was a Pat Dean, the patrolman who had played a role in the Ruby inquiry in two important points. First, he was reportedly in charge of the security at the police department on the day that Oswald was to be transferred. And secondly, he had now come forth with a statement some time just before Ruby's trial, to the effect that he heard Ruby say at the police department, when both he and Ruby were in the room and saw Oswald being ushered from one room to another, Dean says he heard Ruby say, "Someone ought to kill this guy." And that statement attributed to Ruby by Dean was the basis in the trial of meeting the requirement of premeditation that justified application of the death penalty under Texas law. And what Burt was interested in was that Dean's statement about Ruby had never been previously mentioned by him until just before the trial and during the trial. And in fact, Dean had been interviewed by the press on the subject of the investigation. He had written reports to his superiors. There were at least 4 or 5 occasions preceding the trial when he could have mentioned this extremely important statement addressed to Ruby's culpability, and he never did so. So that was one area that Burt wanted to explore in deposition. And the second was that Dean was heard to say on at least 2 occasions that he saw Ruby in the basement of the police department before Oswald came down the aisle and was shot. And he denied making those statements. So Burt pressed him pretty hard and did suggest, and went off the record at one point and suggest that, from what Burt has seen, that there's, he would like the witness to reconsider his testimony because there's conflicting views, and it might be better if there's if it's not completely truthful, this would be the time to correct the matter, and if he needed outside counsel, that could be arranged. In any event, he was questioning his truthfulness without necessarily calling him a liar. So anyway, Dean was upset, reported to Wade, and complaints were made back to Washington. And Burt then provided the copy of the transcript and memoranda as to how it went, what he did, and a memorandum about his off-the-record interview with Dean. And I felt that what Burt had done was thoroughly understandable. He had 2 years as a prosecutor. He handled it in a polite, professional manner, but the subject matter was of such importance that it deserved the kind of cross-examination that he engaged in. Rankin, I think, was not offended by it, but felt that given the complaint by Wade that they sort of had to leave Burt out of Dallas for a while. The only discipline that was enforced was that he was forced to stay in Washington for a brief time. But in any event, I was supportive. Rankin was not offended deeply, and when the Chief Justice was, and when the Chief Justice heard Dean come before him, and Dean complained about Mr. Griffin's attack on his integrity, the Chief Justice said that no one on this staff has any right to challenge your integrity, Mr. Dean. And so that was the end of the affair, but it obviously was very important to Burt and to the Commission.